Should we hear? Brittany, are you hearing anything?
No, not yet.
All right.
I am on mute. I've been on mute and I am talking to myself and I apologize. It wouldn't be a webinar if we didn't have a mess up like this, right, guys? Welcome to the virtual world. So thank you, John.
Oh,
Let's try this again.
I felt like a crazy person there for a little. I'm like, shouldn't somebody be saying something?
Thank you. All right, so let's try this again. I'm going to give my spiel again. So my name is Martina James and I'm staff with APA Virginia. Thank you everybody for joining us this month for our webinar series, Your Hour with APA Virginia, brought to you by the Berkeley Group. All of our webinar information can be found at virginia.planning.org. You can register for our webinars online, and each of the webinars, their synopsis can be found online next month. And December, our webinars are a week early due to the Thanksgiving and Christmas holidays. So please note those date change. Cycling for Sustainable Cities and Making Sense of the Trends and Traps in Virginia's 2020 Census Data are our next two upcoming webinars. So I hope you can join us for those. This month's webinar, using food as economic development. Before we hand it over to our presenters, just a couple housekeeping items. We hope you will submit any of your questions and comments throughout the presentation in the Q&A box, and we'll take those questions at the end of the presentation. We hope that you will share this recording with colleagues. After the presentation is over, it can be found on our YouTube page, which is also linked here at virginia.planning.org, where you can find all of our presentations online, as well as the CM numbers and any of the information correlated with the recording of the presentation. So with that, I am going to hand the webinar over, and you will be able to hear John and Brittany. Thank you, John, for pointing that out. To John Jones and Brittany Keegan, who are presenting our webinar this month, and we appreciate them being with us. And at this point, we'll take it from there.
All right, can I screen share now?
I think so. You should be able to.
I don't think I can. Oh, no, there we go. Okay, do we see a PowerPoint, maybe?
I see it.
Okay. They're often juggling between the multiple screens. I got to make sure I'm doing the right thing. So if Brittany, tell me if the screen's wrong or something like that. So hi, everyone. My name's John Jones. I'm an assistant professor at the Center for Environmental Studies at Virginia Commonwealth University. Thanks so much for joining us, I guess, this afternoon now. We really appreciate it. And I'll let Brittany introduce herself too.
Hi, everyone. My name is Brittany Keegan. I'm the Director of Research Development and Engagement at VCU's Wilder School. So thank you all for being here. And John and I are both excited to speak with you today.
And just a slight bit of background about why we're doing this in this particular at this particular point in time. Brittany and I are part of a National Science Foundation grant application team at VCU, where we're looking at the interdisciplinary use of smart city technology to try to improve access to food and improve food systems. And this is kind of part of a larger initiative that we're trying to do to win this National Science Foundation grant. But this is also directly related to the work that I do, and you'll see that as I'm talking here. And this is related to what Brittany does as well. So we're excited to be here, but we're also certainly we're welcoming feedback, both kind of in general on the presentation and where you might want to see research going for us kind of individually, but then also this larger Smart Cities grant. We're open to feedback about how exactly our potential team and our application team can be interfacing with local officials around the state. So with that, I'll get started here. So where I want to begin with this is I want to talk about how we conceptualize the idea of what local food is, because in a lot of ways we're talking about localized food systems. And a good way to at least start this conversation is it's the idea that local inherently, when we say quote unquote local food, that is inherently a contested definition. And I'm not going to read all the points that I have here on this slide, but local can mean a lot of different things for a lot of different people. It just depends on the context. So what, as two examples, and this is true in other states, and we'll talk more about institutional buying commitments, but as an example, Ohio State University recently made a commitment to try to source, I think it's like 20% of all the food that's served in Ohio State University cafeterias source 20% of all the food by 2020. And I don't think they've made that goal, but they were conceptualizing local from their perspective as a statewide university as any food that's produced in the state of Ohio. Similar, but on a different related note of defining local, we could say, if we were talking about, like, I'm based in Richmond, so if we were looking at this from a Richmond issue, we might say local could be, draw Euclidean buffer of, say, 50 miles around this, around downtown Richmond, or 100 miles or 200 miles. There's a lot of different ways that we can conceptualize what local is and isn't. Additionally, I also want to observe, and this is a big thing in local food systems research. It's a very influential piece, that we need to be aware of what Bourne and Purcell call the local trap, and that's the assumption that local is inherently better than the food that we would be able to access through the globalized, industrialized system. And the best example that I have for this is, I really, really love green grapes. And so if I go to the grocery store, I really want to be able to buy green grapes. But if we're operating from a purely localized argument, like, oh, well, green grape production green grape agriculture needs to occur in Virginia so that people like me can go buy that. Green grapes don't grow well, particularly in Virginia. Maybe they do in various parts, but generally speaking, that's not a crop that is grown here, at least on any sort of significant scale, and especially during the wintertime. So that's an argument, at least against hyperlocalization in all cases, because I want to be able to buy green grapes in January, and Virginia farmers are not going to be able to produce grapes in January. So we need to import those from other parts of the country and potentially other parts of the world. And that's inherently what trade is. And so we need to not fall into the trap that all local is all good all the time. We need some level of skepticism around that. And that frames a lot of the work that I do. And I always try to caution everybody on that point. My work focuses mostly on urban food system development and urban food system economic development. And so I throw out the conceptualization of, when we talk about what these things are or what they could be, I like to argue the term of urban food enterprises or urban food entrepreneurship. And my point is that I'm not necessarily looking at restaurants, so anything that's serving food directly, but rather we're focusing on the production of food, which then may be sold either directly to consumers or could be sold to restaurants or aggregators or whatever. And by looking at this from a holistic perspective, there's 4 different types of production. That could be plant cultivation. So this is an urban farm in New Jersey that I took this picture of, and that's leafy greens that they're growing there. That could also be value-added production. That could be I don't really like this term, but it's often kind of used at farmers markets, these artisanal breads, jellies, cheeses, jams, roasted coffees, fruit butters, spices, all these sorts of things. These are value-added productions. There's also animal husbandry. That's goats, eggs, chicken, fish. This picture in particular, this is from Chicago, I believe. This was a tilapia farm in urban Chicago that picture comes from. And then also I put alcohol production. So that's beer, cider, wine, any distilled spirits, anything like that. I put that in there as well. And my research suggests that a lot of the problems that are facing alcohol producers and their ability to scale up is not super dissimilar from a lot of the challenges that these other micro scale food producers run into. And so by kind of conceptualizing I'm arguing to you that if we can try to conceptualize all these different types of production as kind of the same thing, that can help reframe what this is or what this isn't, I think, in a lot of your minds when you're interfacing with other leadership and with community actors, in your agencies or in your governments. But inherently, there's a lot of data collection limitations about what this sector is and isn't, because, and I've got some additional slides that I'm going to show you on this point, but how we actually count, how we conceptualize, A, and then B, how we count what actually is currently there is very contested, and it's not really obvious how we do that. And so that prevents a lot, that creates a lot of challenges to try to understand what is currently there and what maybe food as economic development could be. Further, if we don't really understand what these businesses are or aren't, or what these emerging businesses are or aren't, then it makes it very difficult to target any sort of programmatic intervention to try to improve conditions for them. And also that's on the supply side of the equation. On the demand side of the equation, we also run into the challenge that on some level, this is the localized food production is probably, at least in the short term, going to cost more than tapping into the globalized industrialized supply chain. So that it may cost more, but then there's also this additional added inconvenience of not being able to just go to the restaurant, like restaurant supply, for instance, or any sort of large aggregator system, or the grocery stores. Tapping into going to a farmer's market, for instance, that's a point of privilege, because it assumes that people have the ability to go and do that. And that also assumes that there's resources there to be able to set up those farmers markets, for instance. The globalized industrialized supply chain is very, very good about interfacing with the types of consumers, be that either individuals or, more often than not, think like grocery stores and restaurants. It's very efficient about doing that. And so if you want to try to disrupt that system, that's going to create difficulties on the supply side. On the demand side, my apologies. Jumping back onto the supply side, I want to talk a little bit about how we conceptualize, and the difficulties of conceptualizing and counting these various types of small scale or micro scale or emerging. Even these terms that I'm using are inherently quite difficult, because we don't really have a centralized way of talking about this. And so this slide, I'm not going to read point by point on all of this. I'm just going to leave that up there for you to look at this. These are examples of different ways that different agencies, mostly at the federal level, try to conceptualize and be able to count what small scale or emerging scale agriculture is. And this is even more problematic if we take this into an urban context, or a peri-urban or suburban context. Most of these definitions are created or conceptualized under the expectation that this is going to occur in kind of overtly rural space. So if we're looking at something that is not inherently rural, that creates a whole set of other problems related to, how do we count this? Similarly, if we talk less on the farming side and more maybe on the value added and the alcohol production, how we count these as small businesses or micro businesses or very small businesses, all these, I'm not going to read all these as well, but these are just different ways of trying to count this same phenomena. And that creates a lot of challenges, because each of these different agencies that are represented in the different citations are trying to count things in a slightly different way. And so that creates challenges for academics like Brittany and I for how can we communicate, how can we gather this information and present to you some sort of coherent picture of, okay, here's what's currently going on, and maybe here's where the potential economic growth is. We can't necessarily do that very easily, and the resources to do that is potentially quite challenging. So I wish that I could just dump a bunch of data on you and say, hey, here it is, but that's inherently very difficult for us. Here's another slide. This is related to NASIC codes, and I just pulled out all the food production related NASIC codes here. And these are really, it's either millions of dollars in revenue or number of employees at the bare minimum is 500 employees for a retail bakery. All the businesses or the proto businesses or emerging businesses that I've interacted with as I've been looking at food production in urban spaces, none of with the exception of maybe a few of the breweries, that's probably not even really true. None of them reach this level where NASIC could potentially be counting them. And so if they're not being counted, how can we really understand what they are or what they aren't, or what they could or what they couldn't be? So that's a big challenge. And this slide got a little cut off here, but so in my dissertation, I proposed this model, and I don't necessarily think that this is necessarily going to catch on, but this is just a way to try to conceptualize this a little bit in your brain of what is a more developed version of a very small scale food production business, or a less developed version of a small scale food production business. we'd be looking at things like gross annual revenue, obviously is a very important one, but also more importantly, land tenure, especially if we're talking about some sort of agricultural activity. You know, do you own the land? If you don't own the land, what sort of lease terms do you have? Because agriculture is inherently a long-term, multi-year process. You can't just take over a vacant lot, you know, in a city or in a suburban context and just suddenly be producing a significant amount of food on that site. It takes a fair bit of infrastructural development, and it takes a few years to get the site to be able to produce at some sort of scale. And so if you only have, you know, a 6-month lease or a year-long lease or even a 2-year-long lease, that could be a big challenge to the potential viability of urban agriculture or suburban agriculture. And then also I make this point of formality, which is kind of trying to get at at what stage in the business cycle are these entrepreneurial exercise. A lot of very, very small scale urban food production that I've looked at in my research is what I call this quote unquote informal scale, in that they may be using cottage food production laws. They may not be reporting, they may not have organized themselves as an LLC or a nonprofit or anything like that. They just kind of exist, exist in an informal sense. And that makes them largely immeasurable. And it also lowers the ability for food safety inspectors to interact with them. It makes it difficult for them to engage with any sort of economic development programming that officials like you all might offer. It makes it difficult for planners to conceptualize what needs that they may have. And these informal enterprises face significant difficulty in actually scaling up into a formal LLC or a formal nonprofit organization. I'm sure you can imagine, I'm not going to get into the details of it, but I'm sure you can imagine some of the barriers that these very small scale or micro scale businesses or micro scale enterprises might face in that scaling up process, because it creates some additional problems for them, just like any other small business entrepreneurial exercise. So I want to pivot slightly now and talk a little bit about the evolution of food systems, and mostly from an urban context. I'm an urbanist, but there's a lot of rural intersections with this as well, as I'm hoping that this will come out. And so we need to kind of start, before we can understand where we're going now in the 21st century, we have to zoom back and talk about pre-industrial food systems. And a really good way of conceptualizing this is based on a Prussian farmer and proto-economist from the 1800s named von Thun. And he had this great exercise where he said, okay, let's look at what he called the isolated state. And his basic point is that, okay, if only one city existed and we ignored geography, how would food production orient itself away from the city? And a lot of the point that he gets at is that because of how quickly food and think like leafy greens and vegetables would spoil, and how much the rent around the land cost would be as you travel further and further away from the city, that is going to orient what activity happens in what spaces away from the city. But the main point that he's making here is that all food is going to be produced and brought into the city for consumption by the residents of the city. So all food production takes place outside the city. Now we can move this away from an idealized model, and the image on the right here kind of tries to put this with some sort of geography. And so this is like a city along a river. And so you might see like leafy green and vegetable production right next to the city. And then as you move out a little bit further, you might see like wheat and corn production and pastures for animals. And then you get further out, and that's where you see true grazing, where you might imagine like pigs and cows and sheep live, because they can then walk into the city. They can then, the drovers can walk the animals into the city for slaughter and then consumption. And I realize that this is a little bit ethereal. I get it. Just roll with me as I'm moving forward through this. So this is kind of like the pre-industrial model. And so local farmers would bring their food to market, and then that market would then be available to local consumers. And you also might have some farmers selling to other regions, that you get a little bit of extra regional trade at that point. So this is kind of like a pre-industrial model. As we shift into in the early part of the industrial revolution, we move towards this idea that mass transportation, at least on some level, breaks this von Thun model and allows food to be sent to other regions for consumption by other populations. And so the image on the left here, this is a railroad map from the United States in the early part of the 20th century. And so on the, in I believe it's El Paso, Texas, I've drawn a few of Von Thune's rings. And what we see here is that the food shed, or the region directly around the city of El Paso, is still probably producing most of the food that's consumed by the people that live in El Paso. But at the same time, the railroad allows cattle production, which is this kind of pinnacle idea of the West, you know, with the cowboys driving cows. That is how we conceptualize the American West. But what are they driving them towards? They're driving them towards the railheads, which then bring all that cattle to Chicago, which is then slaughtered and then put on other trains or ships on the Great Lakes, which brings that food out to the East Coast for consumption by urban residents in the East Coast. And so this is where the first kind of significant inter-regional connection, not to say that that didn't exist at various points in history before, this is just kind of the quintessential example that I can think of, that there's this extra regional aggregation that's going on. And here's a sketch model to try to explain this, and that local consumers are giving food to some sort of regional aggregator that is bringing all the food together, and then that is being sold to urban consumers on a mass scale, as opposed to kind of more individual interactions like what you might see of like kind of like a contemporary farmer's market. So there has to be this sort of regional aggregation effect. And as transportation systems improve, and as as processed food and the stability of food preservation increases, that allows for food to travel for longer and longer distances. This brings us kind of up to the beginning of the 20th century. And as the 20th century is proceeding, there is this a architectural and planning mindset of modernism around the idea of the urban-rural divide. And a lot of you that went to planning school, this was more than likely from a worldview perspective built into a lot of the planning curriculum that you learned from. And this was based on urbanists and sociologists from the Chicago School of Urban Sociology that was very active academically from the 1920s to the 1940s. And they made the point that there's this inherent divide between urban and rural that didn't really exist when we think about Von Thune, that industrialization creates this difference between urban and rural, and that they have to be separate, distinct spheres, and they shouldn't really interact with each other. And that has consequences as we move forward into the later industrial stage. And then I'm going to argue to you in a moment that we're actually in a post-industrial food system, and that this conflict between urban and rural, that distinction doesn't really make a lot of sense anymore. As we shift kind of moving towards World War II and then the second half of the 20th century, that's where we had the emergence of, I guess what I'm calling these extra regional food aggregators. When we may think of this as kind of like the supermartification and the Walmartification of the food system, because food is able to be transported over larger and larger distances, and like refrigeration, packing technology allows for food to be preserved for, in some cases, years, decades, potentially. And that food can be transported over larger and larger distances. And we get these larger and larger aggregators, which are stepping in to draw in food from more and more spaces. And that ends up putting a lot of those regional scale aggregators that we saw earlier in the industrial food system out of business. You know, and I'm sure you're all aware that the Walmartification of the world, and I'm not just picking on Walmart, but that's a good way to conceptualize it, put a lot of small businesses and a lot of small aggregators of not just food products, but lots and lots of products out of business. And so this is largely where kind of the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, we kind of find ourselves. However, I want to make the point to you, and this is an argument that I'm making here, is that I am arguing that we're actually shifting into what I'm calling a post-industrial urban food system. And the seeds for this, and that's definitely an intentional food pun, the seeds for this are, there's a number of them. There's a shift towards trying to eat local in a way that hasn't really been conceptualized before. The demand for local products is greater than it's probably ever been. And that's an important factor. Also this idea of where is our food exactly coming from, who's producing it, what labor conditions exist for the people that are producing it, what products are being added to it, what is the environmental impact of those products. All of that is a consumer sentiment that I don't think was present, say, in the 1960s. Also, the climate change, and this is not something that I've spent a lot of time focusing on, but as the climate change becomes a stronger and stronger problem, that is going to be disrupting where food under the previous industrialized system of bringing food over long, long distances. So think my green grapes problem. If I want to get green grapes in January, but now suddenly because of climate change, a lot of the places that would grow green grapes in January are no longer able to support that type of agriculture because of climate change, where is that food going to come from suddenly? That's a significant problem. Also, add on to, in a post-industrial world, and this is like the image on the bottom left here, there's lots and lots of these industrial spaces or post-industrial spaces that nobody really knows what to do with. This is probably from 10 years ago in Ohio. I saw this image in an old factory that I was touring when I did economic development for the state government. Technology is also shifting in ways that back in the 50s or the 60s we couldn't really conceptualize. This is an aeroponic lettuce farming or lettuce factory technology from a company called Aero Farms, which is based out of Newark, New Jersey originally, although they've expanded. I think they have a lettuce factory in DC now fairly recently. And a lot of this kind of comes back to Von Thune's model, this idea that all food is going to be produced outside the city because land or space within the city is too expensive for food production. We're seeing the opposite, or not the opposite of that, but we're seeing that idea being challenged because these post-industrial spaces, now the cost of them is actually quite low potentially in comparison to what you may have to pay for land outside the city or in the suburban context. And that links with this increase in production potential based on these new technologies. And so the top left image, that's Aero Farms in New Jersey that I mentioned before, and that's they stack the aeroponic, which is very similar to hydroponic, but they use air nutrients misted in air. There's not actually, like, the roots are not being soaked in water. I can answer details on that if you want to hear about it. But look at the verticality of that image. Look how much verticality they can get there. You can't get that in a traditional rural context. Also, the image on the bottom left there, that's Brooklyn Grange, which is in Brooklyn. So they take over the rooftops of buildings and plant potentially. I've been on one of their sites, not the image there, but another site that had an acre and a half of a roof, a roof that was an acre and a half in size under cultivation. And they said they were producing about 150,000 pounds of vegetables from that roof every single year. Image on the top right, this happens to be another New York firm. They're called Square Roots. They build hydroponic vegetable production systems inside shipping containers. And I'm really excited by this idea because they can be stacked on top of each other. So you get that verticality effect, as I mentioned, just like with the Aero Farms example. But also to talk about it in a non-vegetable production sense. Think like the breweries that you've seen, and I know some of you are not based in Richmond, but I know that there's a lot of breweries that have popped up across Virginia over the years. Rich Brow is just one example of breweries coming into some sort of post-industrial or either a post-industrial factory space or a post-industrial commercial space and turning that into a food production space in a way that really wasn't conceptualized before. And because of deindustrialization, because of suburbanization, because of shifts in macro shifts in economic production to other parts of the country and other parts of the world, those spaces are no longer being valued in the same way. And so this brings us to, what sort of potential could food have as economic development? Well, there's strong potential to reuse spaces. As an official in Ohio that I spoke with years ago, his big point was that this sort of technology, and this is the vertical hydroponic or aquaponic food production, or like lettuce farming, basically, could really be well suited towards abandoned big boxes. Here's a Lowe's here pictured. But the nice thing about these buildings is that they're basically just concrete slabs with very high roofs that are completely uniform height roofs. And that's really what the really what the aquaponic, hydroponic production companies really need. And so this is a conceptualization of what a redo of a big box could be. There's aquaponics aquaponics, hydroponics on one level, and then there's a parking lot under that. Now I can't speak to the architectural potential of that. That's a safe activity, but this is as a conceptual exercise. These big boxes could be quite and similar spaces to them could be well positioned to become food production spaces in ways that we haven't really thought about before. Also, there's this idea of place-based economic development. I'm based in Richmond, and I used to live in a neighborhood called Scott's Addition. And there, for a number of reasons, there has been an explosion, is probably a very good word, of alcohol production, both brewing, ciders, distilleries within the neighborhood. And here's all of I think this is up to date. This is all of the images of all the different alcohol producers in the city of Richmond. In Scott's Addition. Now, this is probably too much, I think, probably within the same neighborhood, and some of these will go bust. But Scott's Addition is able to attract a lot of tourism effectively because of all this activity within their region. Also, this idea of a return to regional aggregation, where the Walmartification of the food system destroyed a lot of that regional aggregation. If we want to support localized producers, we need to bring that regionalized aggregation, or sometimes what people call a food hub, back. But there's a significant amount of challenges into doing that, and we can talk about that in the questions. But then also this idea of using urban agriculture as green infrastructure to mitigate the effects of urban heat islands. There's some wonderful mapping that the Virginia Museum of Science has done for the city of Richmond about the effects of urban heat islands. And urban agriculture is one way to try to increase green spaces to try to mitigate urban heat island effects. And I'm working on some mapping techniques to try to help identify potential places to put urban farms to mitigate urban heat islands. But also in the same way they can mitigate heat islands, there's also a potential to absorb stormwater because stormwater overflow can be a significant problem, as I'm sure many of you are probably aware. And so increasing the amount of green spaces at strategic points to try to mitigate stormwater overflow is another potential activity that urban agriculture and similar activities has the potential to do. And I realize that this is not overtly economic development in the traditional sense, but this is more economic development as a mechanism of infrastructure to improve other economic activities within the region. And so that's mostly my spiel. I'm going to turn it over to Brittany now. And Brittany, just tell me when you want me to move slides.
All right, thank you, John. So the next part of this is going to be recommendations for policy and practice. I know we have a pretty wide audience and you all have a lot of different roles to fill. So some of this is going to be from a more macro level, and some of this looks at how people in different roles can work together to address some of these issues and to promote economic development using food. One of the things that John had mentioned is that we just don't always have the data that we need. So one of the first things that we would recommend is considering different ways of measuring outcomes and goals. So what kind of data would you maybe need to be successful in your locality, and how are we going to get it? One thing is to think about what should be measured. Are we looking at economic revenue, maybe just in your locality? Are you working with a couple different localities all nearby? You want to look at the total amount. Are we looking at how individuals are doing? Are we looking at ways that people have better access to food and therefore reducing hunger? It's likely that there are going to be a few different metrics, and that goes to the next thing. So what defines success? What is successful to you? What do you, what do you want to happen? But having those laid out from the beginning can be helpful when you're trying to decide what kind of data you should collect and what your ultimate goals are. Another thing to think about is who should be involved in setting metrics and collecting data. So even though data presents numbers, it's not always neutral. So depending on what perspectives people have and what their goals are, the data collection process can look different. A lot of localities are now kind of going towards a more equity standpoint. So making sure that people who have not previously had access to food or have not been in a position to be able to produce their own food if they would like to, and making sure that those groups are able to have the access that they need. So maybe what they would define success as and what their data collection needs would be different than someone who's already maybe has an established food production setup. How and when the evaluations will take place. So that's once you've can figure out what you're looking for. Are you going to do a longitudinal study? So maybe before, during, and after? Are you going to just collect data at one point in time? Usually looking at something over a period of time is going to provide better data and let you know how you're doing, but metrics and goals need to be set up so that those evaluations will be clear throughout the process. And then who and what should be prioritized. Again, this goes back to the idea of equity. Who, when we're thinking about what success means, and when we're looking at where we want to target economic development, if it's the whole locality or certain groups, who are we prioritizing when we define success and when we think about economic growth? The next slide. Another option is institutional buying commitment. So in many cases, the reason that kind of food production was pulled out of local areas was because of institutional practices. So institutions can also play a role in bringing it back to local areas. Some places, such as Michigan, have started statewide institutional buying programs. You can see in that image that Michigan has 39 institutions participating in this. So Michigan schools, school districts, hospitals, healthcare systems, long-term care facilities, universities, colleges, early childhood programs, and other businesses have agreed to purchase the food that they need from local sources. It's been pretty successful, as you can see in that next chart. So it's the total amount spent on all of these different types of produce. That's over $1 million that has gone back into the local economy because of this type of commitment. And there are several initiatives such as this going on across the country. Next slide. Also, the locations of initiatives. Sometimes people will go in with great intentions like, hey, maybe we'll start a community garden in this place to help provide food for that area and to let people produce their own food. But the location isn't ideal, so it falls through. So here are just a couple things to consider. So physical attributes: does this location have access to sunlight? Or if it's maybe an urban space, is there too much shade from surrounding buildings? Is there easy access to water, or people have to bring in their own water constantly, which could get more expensive and might not be as sustainable? Is the soil good? And just other considerations of the physical space. Proximity to distributors and buyers. So if you want to grow food in the local area, are there people nearby who are going to want to buy that food? Or is it going to be more of a challenge to go to this space to get food than it would be just to go to a local grocery store? Proximity to competition. So if you have too many people in the same area growing the exact same thing or doing the exact same thing, it might be hard for anybody to win. Having some kind of diversity in what is being produced can let everyone kind of have their own space. And also community interests. Locally, we've seen a few different initiatives where someone tries to put in like a local grocery store or a local community garden, and the people in the community just aren't interested. We heard one story where there was a grocery store put into like a food desert area, and it was supposed, in theory, is going to provide accessible and affordable, healthy food to people. The community did not want that. So they actually were willing to spend more of their time and money to drive to a Walmart to get the food that they wanted, rather than using the food that this grocery store was trying to provide. So there wasn't an alignment with community interests and what the as people in power thought was needed by the community. Next slide. There are also different ways to engage the community and different roles that different individuals and community members and policymakers and institutions can all play. This is the socioeconomic model, which is just kind of an easy way to show how people relate to one another. So we have individuals, so a single person with their own knowledge and attitudes and beliefs, whether it's someone who wants to maybe start a business to produce food or people who want to buy food. Interpersonal, so in this case, it's those networks of people producing food, buying from one another and working together, maybe to start a food business or to maybe be a seller and a distributor. Institution, so those larger organizations, with whether it's a larger like food producer or some of the institutions that we were talking about previously who have made a commitment to buying local food. Getting to the larger scales, the institutions with more buying power can be pretty instrumental in deciding if something locally will be a success or not. Community, so how do people in the community feel about any local economic development initiatives regarding food? Is this something they want? Do they think that there's a need for it? Are community members being involved in discussions relating to how we can promote economic development using food? Are those most impacted going to be brought to the table? Or is it going to be a situation where policymakers and those with more power just tell other people what they think is needed? And bringing in those community members, again, can really lead to the success or failure of any initiatives. And then finally, policy. What kind of policies at the state and local level, especially in this case, can impact the success or not of any food growing initiatives locally? Next slide. And finally, you can be an advocate. If there are policies you think that could be helpful at the state level, or statewide policies that could impact local levels, you can work with policymakers yourself to try to either push forward some existing legislation or to create your own. This website is one great way to kind of look at what's currently being done around food policy. It's Virginia's Legislative Information System. So it's just lis.virginia.gov. That's going to be the homepage that you see if you were to go right now, but it lets you search for all of Virginia's senators and delegates. And it also lets you search for current bills that are have either been decided on or that are still in the process. So you can enter keywords related to any initiatives that you want to do. You can see if other people around the state are doing similar things, or if there are any policymakers who might really be in favor of what you're proposing or who have proposed similar things in the past. And that's just a great way to start connecting with other people who might be interested in the same things you are, and maybe get something going to create policies and change. Okay, next slide. All right, and I'll turn it back over to John for this slide. I know we also have had a couple of questions come through in the chat that we might want to consider maybe addressing before the larger discussion.
Yeah, so maybe we could just proceed like this. So I thought of at least a couple discussion questions here. You all, and it sounds like there's been a couple answers that are a couple questions that have already been thrown out, but these are at least some questions that I think might be of interest to some of you. And I thought this was going to be more of like a live presentation so that people could be speaking with us directly and maybe have some sort of discussion, but it sounds like that's not possible with the way that the Zoom is set up, and that's okay. So we just kind of roll with it here. But I can leave this slide up, or we can shift back over to just seeing our faces, depending on what you all want to do. But we can try to respond to questions. These are maybe ways to kind of get people thinking about what potential questions to ask us. So should I just start taking questions from the chat? Is that how you want me to proceed? Somebody tell me what to do.
Yeah, I think maybe start with Tanya's question in the chat and we'll just go in order.
Yeah, I think that sounds good.
We also
So
have some coming in through Q&A and some coming in through the chat.
yeah, so Tanya's question is, how do cities measure the advantage, the competitive market advantage that they may have in order to support industries through potentially zoning or financial incentives or other sort of interventions? And this is not this is on some level. I'm going to throw this question back out to you all. There's some wonder about 2 decades ago. There's some wonderful planning scholars kind of challenged the planning profession to start talking about food production and food systems from a planning lens. And one of the great points that they observed is that within local and to a lesser extent state government, there is not a department of food. There is not one particular entity within government that is responsible for trying to focus on this outside of, you argue USDA at the federal level and to a lesser extent state departments of agriculture, although their missions are quite varied. And so what one of the things that I've been working on for a while now is trying to figure out, okay, within mostly a local, regional, and to a lesser extent state government context, whose responsibility is it to be trying to conceptualize these problems, conceptualize the problems and conceptualize the actors in the system, and then to actually try to do the data collection to figure out how much is present within the system. I don't necessarily have any phenomenal responses to that. I certainly have some responses, but that's a little bit of a it's a little bit of a question that I'm going to kind of throw back out to all of you. What role do you all think? And I know that you all potentially out in the audience wear a lot of different hats. But what role could you all play in your various departments to try to get at this problem? Because it's not just having one singular government work on this is not probably enough of a scale, because if you may be a suburban government, you may be an urban government, you may be a county government, but that it's an interconnected system. So what you do and what you're working on affects what the other governments around you are working on. And so how do you get some sort of regionalized cooperation on this issue is another big challenge that I have some answers for, but I don't pretend to understand all of it, because we're not, as those planning scholars observe, we're not going to get a department of food. That's probably not going to happen. So I can speculate more, Tanya, if you want, but that's to a certain point, that's kind of one of the questions that I've got. I don't really have a great answer for it. So. So I guess if you do want to answer live, I think there's a way to unmute. I think Martina is saying.
I'm happy to unmute whoever, I missed the person that you were interacting with. If you just tell me their name, I'm happy to unmute.
It was Tanya, I think.
Tanya Wilson. Okay,
Tanya
one
Wilson,
second.
yeah.
I'm happy to do that. 1 second.
I'll try to answer some other questions. So Raphael, as regards to startup costs for like a hydroponic or aquaponic vertical farming, the companies that are engaging in that, at least in my interaction with them and looking at the data that's coming out from them, they are very, very tight-lipped because of proprietary trade secrets related to their technologies around the potential startup costs. So I dug a little bit in New Jersey, where I did a lot of my work. I tried to interview a number of them, and they were very, very tight-lipped. So I haven't, at least in the stuff that I've read, I haven't seen anything that really talks about those startup metrics. Maybe they're out there, I just haven't encountered them. But there's a strong incentive, I think, because of how especially for the highly vertical aquaponic, hydroponic technologies are set up, it's requiring a lot of venture capital to often get started. And so because of that, there's a strong incentive to try to obfuscate costs because they're trying to leverage economic development programs and they don't want to necessarily disclose how many jobs they're creating or what the costs are. So I realize that that's not much of an answer for you, but yeah, that's the best I've got.
Tanya is now able to unmute and chat
That's
with you,
okay.
John.
Okay. Let's see here. Somebody. So to Amy's question about the challenges related to food hubs and looking at, say, potential interventions. So Amy, to your point, there's a large, as I mentioned before, with the Chicago School of Sociology and that idea of the urban-rural divide. That urban-rural divide is still definitely present today. There's not much communication between like urban governments and rural governments around this sort of issue. And that on some level advocates for some sort of regional cooperation. And I really think that that's ultimately quite necessary, especially for some sort of regional food hub to get started. But what I often think about, if there's going to be some sort of staff member working for some sort of government or other organization on a regional context, where that person works, like what agency employs them. I don't necessarily have a great insight on that front. I think it's honestly, they're probably not a government employee. They're probably like a university employee, like me or Brittany, or maybe a hospital chain. That is because they have an interregional scope, whereas a lot of you that are working in municipal governments are limited by your jurisdictional territory. And so that's a big challenge in trying to cross that urban-rural divide related to standing up a food hub. But also, I think one of the antecedent factors that needs to be improved to try to get these food hubs going is that there has to be a signal from the demand side, and Brittany talked about this a little bit, related to institutional buyers. So that would be school districts, that would be universities, that would be county jail systems, and anybody that has a cafeteria, to signal to say, hey, we're gonna source 3% or 2%, some quite modest number out of the gate of food from some sort of, and remember, local can be defined in a lot of different ways, but some sort of local producer or some sort of local scale. And that will send a signal to a lot of the local producers in the region, hey, we actually have the ability to sell to, Henrico Public Schools, for instance. And so we're going to scale up our production, because a lot of the producers, be that either value-added producers, urban farmers, peri-urban farmers, maybe not the breweries, because that doesn't make sense for K through 12 school districts, but oftentimes they're capable. These entrepreneurs are telling me, like, hey, I'm actually capable of producing a lot more than I'm currently able to sell. There just isn't a local aggregation point that I can sell to. And so that's an argument towards the idea of a regional food hub, but there has to be somebody or some group that's willing to buy from the food hub on the demand side to justify its existence. So hopefully, at least that answers your question on some level. So Paul's question, is there minimum site size for the indoor farms? That's a good question, Paul. And once again, this is in my interactions with some of these entrepreneurs, they're very tight about, they're very obfuscate about trying to release any sort of information about the viability of their business and the cost inputs, footprints needed, things like that. Because of it, they're trying to, on some level, they're trying to protect trade secrets. And I think it's a little bit, I don't want to say it's nefarious, but I don't know, they've got reasons to try to obfuscate this, I think, because they're trying to make a case towards getting economic development incentives at the state level, I think, and they don't want to disclose everything about how their businesses are set up. But one thing I was able to confirm is that the abandoned big box stores that I was talking about before, that is more or less the spatial form or the design form that they're looking for. So flat concrete surfaces enclosed with uniform level roofs. So think about a lot of 20th century construction, you've got this completely flat roof structure, whereas a lot of 19th century or 18th century construction, you might have changes in the elevation isn't the word, but changes in the, maybe it's the elevation. I'm getting confused on my architectural terminology here, but the roofs aren't even, you might get different slopes, different elevations at different points. And so those buildings are less well positioned to be used for vertical farming because you really want all that verticality as much as you can. Hopefully that at least answers your question at least a little bit. That's wonderful, Jana Watson. I'd love to talk with you more about this. That's great. Moving forward with I've only been in Richmond here for this is my third year here in Virginia. I would like to do more documentation about what some of the local governments around the state are doing on this point, and and making some policy recommendations to you all on a more regular basis. And I'd love to come to come in this sort of format, or come to the annual conference and be talking about this sort of stuff. So if you all have suggestions about things you want me to be researching, I'd love to do that with you. Just give me a little bit more direct feedback, and we'll make sure to get everybody my email address so that if you want to reach out to me directly, that I can talk more about that with you. But that's a great question, Jana Watson. Thank you. Or a great point, rather. Was there anything else I missed?
We have one more question in the chat from Mary.
Mary.
Yeah, so like
hold
back at the pandemic.
There's a chat and then there's a Q&A thing.
Yeah.
So, all right, hold on. Let's see here.
How do we kind of address the issues that small businesses face, especially now that we are in the pandemic, just because of the higher failure rates and so less of a buffer compared to
so the failure rate is a great point. And in other regions, to a certain point, that the churn that all small or micro scale entrepreneurship is going to face, that's going to face localized food production in the same way. However, and I could speak on this more in other regions and less so much here in Virginia, just because I haven't really been here that long and COVID has kind of limited everything that I've been able to do thus far. But there are some I think some low-hanging fruit policy reforms that can be done on the local level or the state level to try to mitigate at least some of the very obvious stumbling blocks that these emerging entrepreneurs might face. A singular good example that I have would be in Richmond, there in Scott's Addition, which is that neighborhood that I mentioned before. There is a meadery, which is alcohol, or you ferment honey and turn that into mead. There is a meadery in Scott's Addition, and the state level licensure that they have to operate under state law is that licensure, and I might be using that term wrong, but there's a requirement on the state level that they have beehives at their site of production. And that law was, or that's probably a rule. That rule was written, and maybe a law, I'm not sure, was likely written under the assumption that a meadery is going to exist in a rural space. The idea of that existing in a highly urban space probably never crossed the mind of the people that were writing that. And so in Scott's edition, they have this it's a little tiny commercial space. It's maybe, I don't know, 1,500 square feet max. And they have two little beehives kind of sequestered off. I have a picture I could show. I just didn't put it in the slide deck. But they've got a little tiny alley space where they have two little beehives, and so that's how they can be in compliance with that regulation, so that they can have their business license. And that is, I think it's a great adaptation that they're able to work around that problem. But it's a little ridiculous in an urban context to say, okay, you have to have this here to be able to operate. And so that's an example of, I think, ways to Mary's point, that there probably is some low-hanging fruit out there that we could be trying to mitigate, to try to get out of the way, to deregulate a little bit, to get out of the way of some of these small businesses, so there's not quite as much churn. Although I don't think you're ever going to be able to completely get rid of that. Hopefully that speaks to a little bit of your question, Mary. Sorry, I don't have better information for you there.
All right.
Yeah, I could try to get Jana's question there. So a lot of that, so how can the really small producers interface with the grocery stores? And also have the shelf space. So if there was some sort of regional aggregator, that the aggregator could be working with the grocery store to kind of make that connection to how the local products actually get into the grocery store. But also very, very low-hanging economic development programming could be working with the local producers to get some of the certifications that they need, because there are some food safety certifications and food safety best practice certifications that producers often need to get, mostly called GAP, which is good agricultural practices, or good handling practices, GHP certifications, that small producers can get, so that the grocery stores are willing to take their products from a food safety perspective. And Virginia Tech and UVA Extension do work in this sort of area, but you all probably could be working with extension services a little bit more to try to lower the burden that these micro scale producers are facing and trying to get these certifications.
All right. Well, I am going
Thanks,
to,
John.
yeah, I'm gonna thank you guys so much for being here. And again, Brittany and John, I appreciate you taking the time and putting together a presentation. And we've had a lot of great questions and a lot of great feedback. We will share your contact information as well as the slides and the recording, as we always do. And again, you know, our webinar series, the fourth Monday of every month, a week early in November and December. But again, you can see this recording as well as all of the supporting information on our YouTube page. So again, thank you to John and Brittany, and we look forward to seeing everybody again next month with us. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everybody.